Having done Arius and Aikenhead, let's move on to some shorter biographies. John Abernethy was born just 4 years after Thomas Aikenhead, and he's been called the father of non-subscription. To be non-subscribing meant that you were not a Calvinist who agreed with the 1646 Westminster Confession of Faith. It usually meant you were more liberal-minded than your Calvinist neighbors. A quote, "To do anything under the notion of service to God without the approbation of our understandings is not to serve him at all, but indeed to affront him, and to debase ourselves beneath the dignity of our nature by neglecting to improve our reason, which is our greatest excellency." Robert Aspland started as a Baptist theology student with a scholarship at the Bristol Academy, but he quit the faith, school, and scholarship in 1800. He served most of his life as a Unitarian minister at the lovely named New Gravel Pit Chapel in Hackney, which is now part of London. He started several Unitarian publications, especially the Monthly Repository and Christian Reformer. He also established the so-called Unitarian Fund for mission work, and he helped when it became part of the British and Foreign Unitarian Association, which is the national British equivalent to the American Unitarian Association. Completely by coincidence, the BFUA and the AUA were founded on the same day, Thursday, May 26, 1825. Being in London, Robert was a leader in negotiating a better deal for Unitarians from the British government. My taste for scandals makes me pause to mention that he spoke with Prime Minister Spencer Perceval in 1812, 2 hours before Perceval was assassinated. Robert was in no way implicated. The assassin was a merchant, John Bellingham, who was falsely imprisoned in Russia for 5 years and was refused compensation by the British government. Bellingham was hanged 6 days later. Perceval remains the only British Prime Minister to be murdered. In 1813, I don't know, perhaps still nervous of saying no to anything, Parliament passed the Doctrine of the Trinity Act. Despite its name, the Act granted tolerance to Unitarians. As of July 22, you could no longer be killed legally for saying that Jesus was not God. Robert has another 32 years of successful organizing, editing, and agitation ahead of him, but he can't top this one, so I will end on that high note. His son, Robert Brook Aspland, succeeded his father as editor of the Christian Reformer and as secretary of the British and Foreign Unitarian Association. The UUA says that the years 1805 to 1870 can be called the Age of Aspland in British Unitarianism. William Adam was Toronto's first Unitarian minister, not Canada's. There were earlier groups in Newfoundland and Montreal. William was born in Scotland and went to India as a Baptist missionary, but while in India, his reading of Scripture led him to Unitarianism. He had no luck converting the Indians, so he came to North America and tried Toronto. He arrived in 1845, but I'm sorry to say he left in 1846. Perhaps his congregation was discouraged by competition from Holy Trinity Anglican Church, which opened the very next year on Bay Street between Queen and Dundas. At any rate, William Adam moved to Chicago. Jane Maria Atkinson was raised Unitarian and moved to New Zealand when she was 28. She met her husband on the trip. New Zealand was still a new settlement, so Jane was a pioneer. Once the family was established, she was a suffragist and allowed the new Nelson College for Girls to use her home. She was the first white woman to climb beautiful Mount Taranaki. Francis Ellingwood Abbot was a man ahead of his time, even for Unitarians. As a spokesman for, quote, free religion, unquote, he said that traditional Christianity was no longer tenable. He rejected all dogma and reliance on scriptures or creeds, teaching that the truth is open to every individual. He was the first American philosopher to endorse Darwin's theory of evolution. Abbot preached, quote, whoever has been so fired in his own spirit by the overwhelming thought of the divine being as to kindle the flames of faith in the hearts of his fellow men, whether Confucius or Zoroaster or Moses or Jesus or Mohammed, has thereby proved himself to be a prophet of the living God, and thus every great historic religion dates from a genuine inspiration by the eternal Spirit. Of course, this was controversial stuff in 1868. The New Hampshire Supreme Court ruled that he was, quote, insufficiently Christian, unquote, and that he and his followers must give up their church in Dover and hand it over to someone less radical. They had a point. They said that if Abbot was a Protestant, then heck, so were the deist, Thomas Jefferson, and the atheist, Thomas Paine. So Abbot left the ministry and devoted the rest of his life to teaching. He wrote books which espoused his liberal theology, trying to reconcile it with science. This is his book, Scientific Theism. And this is the book he published while suing Harvard University for libel after a faculty member reviewed the first book. Well, Unitarian Universalist historians have been kind to Abbot, and of course to Jefferson and Paine, both of whom are named in some lists as Unitarians. Abbot was an extremely devoted husband, as chronicled in a collection of his correspondence and diary entries entitled, If Ever Two Were One. He lived for 67 years, and then, on the 10th anniversary of his wife's death, he committed suicide by taking poison at her graveside. Martha Avery was born with a silver spoon, but it didn't save her from being an orphan at age 13. She went to live with her grandfather, a state senator in Maine. As a young adult, she joined a Unitarian congregation. She married and moved to Boston. Martha became a socialist, and in 1888 joined one of hundreds of so-called nationalist clubs founded to support the political agenda of Edward Bellamy. Bellamy had written a utopian science fiction book predicting an ideal world by the year 2000. Alas. Well, perhaps we haven't done too badly. Bellamy's movement was little more than a fad, ending before he died in 1898. The Averys became disenchanted with socialist extremism. Martha and her friend David Goldstein published a book called Socialism, the Nation of Fatherless Children, which is indeed a criticism. And Martha found a surprising new hero, Pope Leo XIII. By 1878, the Vatican had resigned itself to losing the Papal States to the new country of Italy. They elected a pope with a social justice agenda, a better deal for workers. Martha and David both converted to Catholicism and began forming Catholic trade unions, the Common Cause Society and the Catholic Truth Guild. They toured New England in a Ford Model T Autovan with a loudspeaker and a cross, spreading the word. Although long gone, the Catholic Truth Guild remains the largest lay apostolate in the history of the Catholic Church in the USA. Johannes Auer was a Harvard professor. The UUA once suggested that, quote, he was probably the first and only humanist professor of theology in the United States, unquote. I doubt the only part is still true today. John Luther Adams is not only this is not the modern American composer of the same name, and I don't know if they are related. Our James Luther Adams was raised in a fundamentalist Christian family. In college, he briefly became a humanist atheist, but he soon returned to Christianity as a non-dogmatic Unitarian. He attended Harvard Divinity School as both a student and a teacher. He also spent time as a Unitarian parish minister, social activist, journal editor, and distinguished scholar. He spent years in Europe and introduced European theologians like Paul Tillich to an American audience. Here's a quote from his UUA biography. Adams decisively shaped the minds of hundreds of students in preparation for the liberal ministry and other scholarly professions as well. Adams was the most influential theologian among American Unitarian Universalists of the 20th century and one of the finest 20th century American liberal Christian theologians generally. Mel Ash is a Zen Buddhist teacher and author and a convert to UU. And he photographs beautifully, doesn't he? Mel is my most recent person, but I have two organizations that were born after Mel. This is ANZUUA, the Australia and New Zealand UU Association. Because someone pointed them out to me, this second edition that I'm working on will add about a dozen Australian and New Zealand biographies. The American Unitarian Conference was incorporated by Dean Fisher and David Burton in Virginia in the year 2000. That was not its original name. It wanted to be the American Unitarian Association, the same name used by William Ellery Channing in 1825. They think they are closer to Channing's ideas than the UUA. And in fact, they're probably right. But even so, the UUA has the trademark and a right to protect its historical connection. They sued. Dean and David settled amicably in 2001, and they're now called the Conference. In his manifesto, Dean said, quote, "As anyone who has honestly surveyed the UU landscape in this country well knows, Unitarian Universalism is quite a hodgepodge," unquote. Well, I can't disagree. UU is based on common principles, not common beliefs. The AUC is a more conservative group. They want less politics, less social action, and more spirituality. They are still pretty liberal. They quote Theodore Parker, for example, our first minister to declare he was non-Christian and still be allowed to keep his pulpit. Sorry to say, I doubt the AUC is going to make it in the long run. I have been searching high and low on the internet for Unitarians, and it took me 10 years to find them. Their online presence is very sparse. Even so, I wish them well. Dean said, quote, "Independence, of course, does not mean we cannot cooperate with the UUA. We would hope that as two religiously liberal organizations dedicated to religious tolerance, there would be many avenues of cooperation," unquote. Well, I hope the same.